Her husband starves the black for being fat, until a rancher said, "Come with me, you'll never go hungry," as the trembling woman clutches her hollow stomach outside the general store. The townsfolk whisper and point at the skeletal figure they call Moses's burden, certain she'll waste away within the month like discarded cattle. But when the weathered mountain man steps from the shadows, he sees what others cannot, the sharp intelligence burning behind her sunken eyes. His ranch operates under different rules, where her forgotten skills could save dozens of lives currently hidden in his barn. Yet accepting his offer means exposing a secret network that feeds hope to the desperate, risking everything he's built and everyone he's sworn to protect. Will one starving woman's desperate choice become their salvation, or will it destroy the only sanctuary for miles? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the Whitmore household as Violet Green quietly prepared breakfast for the children. Her hands trembled slightly as she portioned the eggs, saving the smallest piece for herself. The hollow ache in her stomach had become a constant companion over the past months. Little Sarah Whitmore tugged at Violet's worn skirt. The child's ribs showed through her thin nightgown. Her parents had forgotten to leave money for food again. Violet glanced toward the door, then quietly slid half her meager portion onto Sarah's plate. The sound of heavy boots on the porch made Violet's spine stiffen. Moses Green pushed through the door without knocking. His eyes immediately found the plates on the table. Moses grabbed Violet's wrist. His fingers left white marks on her dark skin. The children scattered to their rooms like frightened mice. The walk to the general store felt endless. Moses kept one hand clamped on Violet's shoulder, steering her through the dusty streets of Dustwood territory. Curious eyes followed their progress. Whispered conversations died as they passed. Inside Patterson's general store, the smell of fresh bread made Violet's stomach clench. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her ledger. Her expression shifted from polite interest to thinly veiled disgust. Moses approached the counter. He pointed at a small bag of flour and some dried beans. Mrs. Patterson weighed the items carefully, her movements deliberate and slow. Violet's eyes lingered on the glass jars filled with candy. She remembered when her grandmother used to slip her peppermint sticks during the harvest season. The memory felt like a lifetime ago. Mrs. Patterson placed the items on the counter. Moses reached for his coin purse, then stopped. His gaze fell on Violet, who was unconsciously touching her empty stomach. Moses's voice cut through the store's quiet atmosphere. Every head turned toward them. Violet felt the weight of their stares like physical blows. She kept her eyes fixed on the wooden floor, counting the knots in the boards. The other customers began to murmur among themselves. Some nodded in apparent approval of Moses's public discipline. Others simply stared with the morbid fascination reserved for public spectacles. Violet had learned long ago that protest only made things worse. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back. Her breathing remained steady despite the shame burning in her chest. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly, but she made no move to intervene. The unspoken rules of the community were clear. A man's business with his wife was his own affair. Moses paid for the meager supplies and turned toward the door. Violet followed 2 steps behind, her head still bowed. The whispers grew louder as they prepared to leave. A shadow fell across the doorway. A tall figure stepped aside to let them pass, then followed them outside. Violet didn't look up, but she could feel someone watching. The stranger's boots made soft sounds on the wooden sidewalk. He moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. His clothes were well made but practical, designed for hard work rather than display. Grayson Cade had been watching the scene unfold from the moment Moses raised his voice. Something about the woman's dignified silence caught his attention. Most people in her situation would have argued or pleaded. She simply endured. Moses began loading the supplies into their wagon. He continued his public lecture, his voice carrying across the street. Several townspeople had gathered to watch the show. Violet climbed into the wagon without assistance. Her movements were careful and measured, conserving energy that food should have provided. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes hung loose on her diminished frame. Grayson stepped forward. His voice was quiet but carried clearly in the afternoon air. Moses stopped mid-sentence, surprised by the interruption. The offer hung in the air like morning mist. Violet's head snapped up for the first time since entering the store. Her eyes met Grayson's briefly before darting away. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Moses's face darkened. His hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his belt, then stopped. Grayson's reputation for fairness was matched only by his reputation for settling disputes definitively. The crowd held its breath. Public challenges were rare in Dustwood territory. Most disagreements were settled behind closed doors or not at all. Violet looked between the two men. Her future hung in the balance of their confrontation. Staying meant slow starvation and continued humiliation. Leaving meant stepping into the unknown with a stranger. Grayson's ranch was legendary in the territory. Stories circulated about his wealth and his eccentric hiring practices. Some said he took in people others wouldn't trust. The rumors were neither entirely positive nor completely negative. Moses stepped closer to Grayson. The two men were roughly the same height, but Moses carried the lean desperation of someone fighting for scraps. Grayson had the solid presence of someone who had never known real hunger. Violet's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. Several onlookers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of their own recent meals. The decision crystallized in that moment of public embarrassment. Violet stood slowly, her legs unsteady from malnutrition and fear. She looked directly at Grayson for the second time. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute commitment. Moses lunged forward, but Grayson was already helping Violet down from the wagon. The crowd began to disperse, sensing the confrontation was over. Some looked disappointed by the anticlimactic resolution. Others seemed relieved that violence had been avoided. As they walked toward Grayson's horse, Violet caught a glimpse of her reflection in the store window. The woman looking back was a stranger, thin and hollow-eyed, but with something new flickering behind her gaze. The ride to Cade Ranch stretched longer than Violet expected. Grayson's horse moved at a steady pace through terrain that gradually shifted from dusty flatlands to rolling hills dotted with oak trees. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried weight. Violet's body ached from the unfamiliar position. Months of poor nutrition had weakened muscles she once took for granted. She gripped the saddle horn tighter as they navigated a steep incline. The ranch appeared suddenly as they crested a hill. Unlike other spreads in the territory, this one seemed to breathe with life. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. People moved between buildings with purpose rather than the sluggish desperation she knew from town. Grayson dismounted first, then helped Violet down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched solid ground. The embarrassment of her weakness flushed her cheeks, but Grayson pretended not to notice. A woman emerged from the main house. Her skin was darker than Violet's, and she carried herself with unmistakable authority. She wore a clean apron over sturdy work clothes, and her hair was arranged in neat braids. The woman studied Violet with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Violet recognized the look of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly. After a moment, the woman's expression softened slightly. Grayson gestured toward the main house. As they walked, Violet noticed details that seemed wrong for a simple cattle ranch. The windows had heavy shutters that could be barred from inside. Multiple horses stood saddled in the corral, as if ready for immediate departure. Inside, the house defied every assumption Violet had formed. The main room was larger than most buildings in town. Tables lined the walls, set for far more people than any family would require. The kitchen area bustled with activity as several women prepared what looked like enough food to feed an army. A child ran past, chasing a wooden toy horse. His laughter filled the space with warmth Violet hadn't experienced in years. More children appeared, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers. Their faces reflected a mixture of ethnicities that would have caused scandal in Dustwood territory. Grayson touched Violet's elbow gently. She followed him toward a quieter corner of the room where they could speak without interruption. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The explanation came in careful, measured words. Grayson spoke quietly, but his voice carried the conviction of absolute truth. This wasn't just a cattle ranch. It was something far more dangerous and infinitely more important. Families passed through regularly, he explained. Some stayed for days, others for weeks. All of them were traveling north toward a freedom that remained fragile and uncertain. The ranch served as a way station, providing food, rest, and guidance for the most perilous part of their journey. Violet's hands began to shake, not from hunger this time, but from the magnitude of what she was hearing. The stories she had whispered about during slavery, tales of safe houses and secret routes, were real. She was standing in the middle of one. The woman who had greeted them earlier approached with a bowl of stew. The smell hit Violet like a physical blow. Her stomach clenched so hard she had to sit down. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen so much food in one place. The first spoonful nearly brought tears to her eyes. The flavors were simple, but perfect. Beef, potatoes, carrots, and herbs combined in a harmony that spoke of abundance rather than survival. She forced herself to eat slowly, knowing her shrunken stomach couldn't handle too much at once. As she ate, Grayson continued his explanation. The operation required careful coordination. Timing was critical. One mistake could doom not just the current refugees, but everyone who had passed through before. Trust was the only currency that mattered, and it had to be earned completely. The barn held the true secret. Grayson led her there after she finished eating. From outside, it looked like any other ranch building. Inside, it had been transformed into temporary living quarters. Families huddled together on clean bedding, their possessions gathered in small bundles. A man approached them, his face weathered by years of outdoor work. He spoke quietly to Grayson, gesturing toward a map spread on a makeshift table. Violet caught fragments of the conversation: weather conditions, safe houses, patrol schedules. Something clicked in Violet's mind as she listened. The logistics reminded her of something from her past. During the worst years of slavery, she had helped coordinate food distribution among the workers. The plantation had been large enough that keeping everyone fed required careful planning and precise timing. Her memory had always been unusual. Names, faces, routes, schedules. She remembered everything with perfect clarity. It had been a survival skill then. Master's overseers had relied on her to track which workers were where and when they needed to be moved or reassigned. She had hated using her gift in service of oppression. But here, in this barn full of hope and quiet desperation, she saw how those same skills could serve a different master entirely. Grayson was still talking with the weathered man when Violet stepped closer to the map. The routes were marked in pencil, easy to erase if necessary, but they were also incomplete. Several gaps existed where safer paths could be established. Without thinking, she pointed to a spot on the map. The conversation stopped as both men turned to look at her. She explained about the creek bed that ran parallel to the main road. During her time with the Whitmores, she had walked that path many times. It offered cover and fresh water, two critical resources for traveling families. The weathered man studied the map again, then nodded slowly. Grayson's expression was unreadable, but something had shifted in his posture. He was seeing her differently now, not as a victim to be rescued, but as someone with value to contribute. That night, Violet lay on a real bed for the first time in months. Her stomach was full, her body was warm, but her mind raced with possibilities she had never dared imagine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in years, she looked forward to facing them. 3 weeks at the ranch transformed Violet in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her face filled out, her hands steadied, and her mind sharpened with proper nutrition. More importantly, she had found her purpose in the careful choreography of survival. The coded meal system emerged naturally from her kitchen duties. Different combinations of foods left at specific locations told the refugees everything they needed to know. Cornbread with honey meant travel at dawn. Biscuits without butter signaled delays. Apple slices arranged in patterns indicated which route to take north. Her photographic memory proved invaluable in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. She could recite the names and faces of every family that had passed through in the past month. More critically, she remembered every detail about safe houses, sympathetic contacts, and dangerous areas along the escape routes. The system worked flawlessly until it didn't. Word reached the ranch on a Tuesday morning that sent ice through Violet's veins. The Morrison family, who had left just 4 days earlier, had been captured near Willow Creek. They should have been safely across the state line by then. Grayson's jaw tightened as he absorbed the news. The Morrisons had 3 children, including a baby who couldn't have survived long in custody. The implications extended far beyond one family's fate. Someone was feeding information to the authorities. The timing was too precise, the location too exact to be coincidence. Every successful capture meant the entire network grew more vulnerable. Suspicion fell on Violet like morning frost. She was the newest member of their operation, the one with the least proven loyalty. Her arrival coincided perfectly with the sudden increase in failed escapes. The whispered conversations stopped when she entered rooms. People who had welcomed her warmly now watched her with careful eyes. Even the children seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Grayson struggled visibly with his doubts. Their personal connection had grown stronger each day, built on shared work and quiet conversations by the evening fire. But his responsibility to the network superseded any individual relationship. The tension reached a breaking point when another family was captured. The Johnsons had followed the exact route Violet had helped plan. They had used her coded meal system to time their departure. The evidence seemed overwhelming. That night, Violet lay awake staring at the ceiling. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. After years of being falsely accused by Moses, she now faced genuine suspicion for something equally untrue. The old patterns of doubt and isolation threatened to swallow her again, but this time was different. This time she had skills, knowledge, and most importantly, she had something worth fighting for. Violet began her own investigation the next morning. If someone was betraying the network, they had to have access to detailed information about timing and routes. The circle of people with that knowledge was smaller than it appeared. She started by retracing every conversation, every shared meal, every casual interaction from the past month. Her memory painted clear pictures of who had been where when critical information was discussed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Little Sarah Whitmore appeared at the ranch on Thursday afternoon, ostensibly visiting with her mother. But Sarah sought out Violet specifically, bubbling with excitement about her new game. Sarah explained how her father had been asking her questions about her visits to see Violet. He wanted to know about the people she met, the things she saw, the conversations she overheard. Sarah thought it was wonderfully fun to have secret talks with Papa about her adventures. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Thomas Whitmore had been using his own daughter as an unwitting spy. The innocent child's reports provided a detailed picture of the ranch's operations, complete with timing, personnel, and procedures. Violet's stomach turned as she realized her own role in the betrayal. Her kindness to the Whitmore children, her natural tendency to include them in kitchen activities, had provided perfect cover for intelligence gathering. Every time she had explained her coded food system to keep them entertained, she had been feeding information directly to their father. The revelation demanded immediate action, but also presented an opportunity. If Thomas Whitmore was relying on his daughter's innocent reports, then those same reports could be manipulated to serve their purposes instead. Violet spent that evening crafting a careful plan. She would need to feed false information through Sarah while simultaneously coordinating the largest rescue operation in the network's history. 32 people currently waited in the barn, including 6 families with young children. The next morning brought disturbing news from town. Moses had allied himself with Sheriff Reed, and both men were asking pointed questions about Grayson's ranch. The local pressure was building toward an inevitable confrontation. Violet realized that her personal reckoning with Moses would have to wait. The immediate priority was getting the refugees to safety before the authorities moved against them. But the timing would be critical, and margin for error had disappeared entirely. She began implementing her counterintelligence plan that afternoon. When Sarah arrived for her regular visit, Violet casually mentioned the wrong travel dates and routes while the child helped in the kitchen. The false information was detailed enough to be believable, but would lead any pursuit in completely the wrong direction. Meanwhile, she coordinated with Grayson to move the real departure up by 2 full days. The refugees would travel in smaller groups using alternate routes that avoided the compromised paths entirely. The complexity of managing both operations simultaneously pushed Violet's organizational abilities to their limits. Every detail had to be perfect. A single mistake would doom not just the current refugees, but potentially expose the entire network to destruction. As evening approached, Violet stood in the kitchen where her transformation had begun. Tomorrow would test everything she had learned, everything she had become. The scared, starving woman who had arrived a month ago was gone, replaced by someone she was still learning to recognize. The stakes had never been higher, but for the first time since childhood, Violet Green felt truly ready for the challenge ahead. Dawn broke gray and cold as Violet put her plan into motion. She had spent the sleepless night organizing every detail in her mind, cross-checking routes and timing until the sequence burned bright in her memory. Today would determine whether her transformation from victim to strategist was real or merely wishful thinking. The refugees began moving before sunrise. Violet had divided them into 6 groups, each taking a different path north. The families with the youngest children went first, their extra rest stops factored into carefully calculated departure times. Sarah Whitmore arrived at the ranch just as the last group disappeared into the tree line. The child skipped into the kitchen, unaware that her innocent presence was about to seal her father's fate. Violet greeted her with warm smiles and fresh biscuits, maintaining the facade of normalcy while her heart hammered against her ribs. The false information flowed naturally during their cooking lesson. Violet mentioned the big departure planned for tomorrow evening, complete with detailed routes that would lead any pursuit directly into Sheriff Reed's trap. Sarah absorbed every word with the eager attention of a child playing an important grown-up game. Meanwhile, Grayson worked frantically to eliminate any evidence of the ranch's true purpose. The barn was cleaned and restocked with legitimate feed. The maps were burned. The extra bedding was hidden in root cellars that had been dug for exactly this purpose. By mid-morning, the transformation was complete. Cade Ranch looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a prosperous cattle operation run by a man who valued privacy and hard work. Only the most determined search would reveal anything suspicious. The first test came earlier than expected. Moses arrived with Sheriff Reed and 3 deputies, their horses kicking up dust clouds visible from miles away. Violet watched from the kitchen window as they approached, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what hung in the balance. Grayson met them at the main gate with the calm confidence of a man who had nothing to hide. He invited them to search wherever they pleased, offered refreshments, and chatted pleasantly about cattle prices and weather patterns. Sheriff Reed's frustration was evident as his men found nothing more incriminating than well-organized feed supplies and meticulously maintained equipment. The barn held only cattle and horses. The bunkhouse showed signs of normal ranch hands, nothing more. Moses grew increasingly agitated as the search continued. He had staked his reputation on exposing whatever illegal activities were happening at the ranch. The complete absence of evidence made him look foolish in front of the law. Violet emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee and sandwiches for the searchers. The sight of his wife serving refreshments to their guests drove Moses into barely controlled rage. She moved with quiet dignity, no longer the broken woman he had controlled through starvation and humiliation. The contrast was stark enough to make even the deputies uncomfortable. They had expected to find evidence of wrongdoing, but instead they found a well-run operation and a woman who clearly thrived in her new environment. Thomas Whitmore arrived as the official search was winding down. He had come to collect Sarah and hopefully witness the exposure of the Underground Railroad he had worked so hard to compromise. Instead, he found his daughter happily helping in a normal ranch kitchen while law enforcement prepared to leave empty-handed. Sarah's excited chatter about tomorrow's big adventure filled the awkward silence. She repeated every detail Violet had carefully planted, describing the late evening departure and the specific routes the refugees would supposedly take. Thomas listened with growing confidence, already planning how to position his men for maximum capture efficiency. The irony was exquisite. The man who had betrayed dozens of families through his daughter's innocent reports was now being deceived by that same child. Violet maintained her warm smile while watching justice prepare to serve itself. As the search party prepared to leave, Sheriff Reed made one final attempt to find something suspicious. He questioned Violet directly about her reasons for leaving her husband and her new role at the ranch. His tone carried the implicit threat that her answers would be scrutinized for any hint of deception. Violet's response was masterful in its simplicity. She spoke about finding honest work and regular meals after months of uncertainty. Her words contained nothing but truth, yet they completely concealed the larger reality of what she had become. Moses made his own final play, demanding that Violet return home to fulfill her wifely duties. His public claim carried legal weight in their territory, where women had few rights independent of their husbands. But Grayson stepped forward with papers that changed everything. Violet's employment contract included specific provisions that protected her from forced return to an abusive situation. More importantly, the document bore the signatures of 3 prominent ranchers who vouched for both her character and her value as a skilled worker. The legal protection was real and comprehensive. Moses had no grounds to compel her return, and Sheriff Reed had no evidence to support any criminal charges. Their grand expedition had failed completely. As the frustrated lawmen rode away, Thomas Whitmore lingered long enough to confirm the details of tomorrow's supposed escape attempt with his daughter. Sarah repeated Violet's false information perfectly, adding her own innocent embellishments that made the deception even more convincing. After the visitors departed, the ranch settled into an eerie calm. 32 refugees were scattered across the countryside, following routes that would take them to safety while their pursuers chased shadows. The network had survived its greatest test through careful planning and strategic misdirection. Violet stood in the evening stillness, watching the last dust clouds disappear over the hills. Her transformation was complete in ways that went far beyond physical recovery. She had evolved from victim to protector, from the hunted to the hunter. Tomorrow would bring news of the failed trap and Thomas Whitmore's exposure as an untrustworthy informant. The man who had betrayed so many families would finally face consequences for his actions. Justice would be served through intelligence rather than violence, exactly as it should be. The trap sprung perfectly at dawn. Sheriff Reed and his men waited in the designated location, watching empty trails while 32 refugees crossed safely into the next territory. The false information had worked exactly as Violet planned, sending the authorities on a futile chase through predetermined locations. Word of the failed raid reached Dustwood territory by mid-morning. The story spread quickly through the small community, growing more embarrassing with each retelling. Sheriff Reed had mobilized every available deputy based on intelligence that proved completely worthless. Thomas Whitmore's reputation crumbled within hours. Townspeople began questioning how his information could have been so dramatically wrong. Whispers circulated about his reliability and judgment. Several prominent families quietly withdrew their children from his care, no longer trusting his decision-making abilities. The federal investigation followed swiftly. Authorities from the territorial capital arrived to examine Sheriff Reed's financial records and question his recent activities. Evidence of bounty payments and irregular arrests painted a damning picture of corruption that could no longer be ignored. Moses found himself increasingly isolated as the truth emerged. His alliance with discredited lawmen made him appear foolish rather than righteous. The community support he had expected for his campaign against the ranch never materialized. Instead, people began talking openly about his treatment of Violet. Her transformation from the starving woman they remembered to the dignified person they now saw raised uncomfortable questions about his character. The contrast was too stark to ignore or excuse. Violet returned to town 3 days later to settle her affairs. She walked through the streets with her head held high, her body healthy and strong, her purpose clear. The change was so dramatic that some residents barely recognized her. At the general store, Mrs. Patterson served her with newfound respect. The woman who had once watched silently as Moses denied his wife food now offered genuine courtesy and fair treatment. Money exchanged hands without humiliation or commentary. The confrontation with Moses happened outside the bank. He had been waiting, desperate for one final chance to reassert his authority over the woman who had escaped his control. His appearance shocked Violet more than she expected. Moses had deteriorated in the weeks since her departure. His clothes hung loose on his diminished frame. His eyes held the hollow look of someone who had discovered that cruelty without victims becomes self-consuming. The man who had starved his wife was now starving himself through isolation and bitterness. When he demanded her return, Violet's response carried the quiet authority of someone who had found her true strength. She spoke without anger or hatred, simply stating the reality of their situation. Her life had moved beyond his reach, and she would never again accept treatment that diminished her worth. Moses tried to invoke legal and social conventions that might compel her obedience. But his words fell flat in the face of her obvious prosperity and dignity. The community members who witnessed the encounter saw clearly which of them had thrived and which had withered. The moral victory was complete without requiring revenge or retaliation. Violet had proven her worth through service to others rather than dominance over her oppressor. The contrast spoke more powerfully than any accusation could have managed. Grayson arrived as the confrontation reached its peak. His presence alone shifted the balance of power definitively. Moses had no allies left, no authority to invoke, no social standing from which to make demands. The partnership between Violet and Grayson had evolved naturally from employer and employee to something far more significant. Their shared work had revealed compatible values and complementary skills. Trust had grown through tested reliability rather than romantic gestures. Their relationship announcement surprised no one who had observed them together. The community had already begun treating Violet as Grayson's partner in both business and personal matters. The formalization simply acknowledged existing reality. 6 months after leaving Moses, Violet stood before the Dustwood Territory Council to request official recognition of their sanctuary operation. The Underground Railroad was becoming a legitimate refugee assistance organization, operating openly with community support. The council's approval came unanimously. Several members admitted they had long suspected the ranch's true purpose, but had chosen to look the other way. The successful integration of former refugees into the local economy had proven the value of their work. Thomas Whitmore's final disgrace came when his own children testified about his attempts to use them as spies. The community's protective instincts toward children overrode any remaining sympathy for his position. He left town within the week, his reputation permanently destroyed. Sheriff Reed faced federal charges for corruption and civil rights violations. His replacement came from the territorial capital with specific instructions to support rather than hinder refugee assistance efforts. The official policy shift reflected changing attitudes at higher levels of government. Moses made one last attempt to salvage his situation by publicly apologizing for his past behavior, but his words rang hollow after months of demonstrable cruelty. The community had moved beyond forgiveness to simple indifference regarding his fate. The transformation was complete when Violet opened her own establishment in town. The boarding house provided temporary housing for refugees, while they established permanent situations. Her coded meal system evolved into a communication network that served the entire territory. Former enemies who sought genuine reconciliation found her willing to offer second chances. Those who simply wanted to benefit from her success without acknowledging past wrongs discovered she had developed excellent judgment about human character. The woman who had once begged for scraps now ensured that no one in her community went hungry. Her greatest suffering had indeed become her greatest strength, exactly as the story had promised from the beginning. The boarding house's opening celebration drew people from across the territory. Even some who had previously scorned her attended, drawn by curiosity about her remarkable transformation. They found a gracious hostess who served abundance without reproach. As evening fell on the celebration, Violet looked across the crowded room with deep satisfaction. Every person present had enough to eat. Every conversation reflected respect rather than condescension. The world she had helped create was exactly what she had dreamed during her darkest moments. 1 year later, the Autumn Harvest Festival transformed Dustwood Territory into something unrecognizable from the town that had once watched Moses starve his wife in public. Golden corn stalks decorated every storefront, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from multiple kitchens working in cheerful competition. Violet stood in the center of it all, directing the preparation of the community feast with the same precision she had once used to coordinate refugee escapes. Her boarding house had become the unofficial headquarters for all major town events, a role that would have seemed impossible during her darkest days with Moses. The morning preparations buzzed with activity as former refugees worked alongside longtime residents. The Henderson family, who had passed through the underground network 8 months earlier, now ran the town's most successful blacksmith shop. Their teenage son helped carry tables while their daughter arranged wildflowers in mason jars. Maria Santos emerged from the kitchen carrying a massive pot of her famous stew. She had arrived at the ranch nearly broken, fleeing violence with her 3 small children. Now she managed the boarding house kitchen and taught cooking classes to young women throughout the territory. The transformation extended far beyond individual success stories. The entire economic structure of the region had shifted as new businesses emerged to serve the growing population. What had once been a struggling frontier town now thrived with the energy of people who had chosen to stay, rather than those who simply had nowhere else to go. Grayson supervised the setup of additional seating areas, his easy smile reflecting the contentment that had settled over him in recent months. The solitary man who had once hidden his humanitarian work now moved openly through a community that celebrated his contributions. Their marriage had surprised no one, though the ceremony itself had been the social event of the decade. Violet had insisted on a simple service, but the community had other plans. Every family they had helped sent representatives, creating a gathering that spilled far beyond the church and into the surrounding streets. The official recognition of their refugee assistance organization had brought federal funding and legal protection for their work. What had once operated in dangerous secrecy now received government support and community praise. The Underground Railroad had evolved into something far more sustainable and effective. Children ran between the tables, their laughter providing a soundtrack of pure joy that made everything else worthwhile. Among them were the Whitmore children, now living with the Henderson family after their father's disgrace and departure. Sarah had grown tall and confident, showing no signs of the neglect she had endured in her original home. The arrival of the afternoon train brought the final guests for the celebration. Representatives from the territorial government stepped onto the platform, followed by several families who had traveled from distant settlements to attend the festival. Among the passengers was Moses Green. His appearance shocked those who remembered him. The man who had once terrorized his wife through starvation had himself become gaunt and hollow-eyed. His clothes were clean but worn, and he moved with the careful hesitation of someone unsure of his welcome. Violet saw him before he saw her. The recognition hit like cold water, bringing back memories of hunger and humiliation that she had worked hard to transform into strength. But the fear that had once paralyzed her was gone, replaced by something far more powerful. Moses approached slowly, hat in hand, his eyes fixed on the ground. When he finally looked up, the change in Violet took his breath away. She stood surrounded by friends and community leaders, clearly comfortable in her role as one of the town's most respected citizens. His apology was quiet and sincere, witnessed by dozens of people who remembered the cruelty he had once displayed so publicly. He spoke about the emptiness that had consumed him after her departure, the way his hatred had turned inward when it no longer had an external target. Violet listened without interruption, her expression calm and thoughtful. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, considering not just his words, but the man who had spoken them. Her response reflected the wisdom she had gained through her journey from victim to leader. She acknowledged his apology without accepting responsibility for his redemption. The work of becoming a better person would have to be his own, just as her transformation had ultimately been her own responsibility. But she also extended an invitation to stay for the festival meal. The gesture was witnessed by the entire community, a demonstration of the grace and strength that had made her such an effective leader. The feast began at sunset, with tables stretching down Main Street and spilling into side roads. Every person present had a place at the table, from the territorial representatives to the newest refugees still learning English. Violet stood to address the gathering as the meal began. Her words were simple and heartfelt, focusing on the power of community to transform individual lives and the responsibility each person had to ensure no one went hungry or homeless. The coded meal system that had once communicated escape routes now organized community support for anyone facing hardship. Violet's boarding house had become the central hub for a network of care that extended throughout the territory. As the evening progressed, Moses found himself in conversation with people he had once scorned. Their willingness to include him despite his past behavior provided a living example of the redemption that was possible through genuine change and community support. The festival continued late into the night, with music and storytelling replacing the formal presentations. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms while adults shared memories and made plans for the future. In the quiet hours before dawn, Violet walked through the empty streets, surveying the remnants of the celebration. Discarded plates and cups told the story of abundance shared freely among people who had once known scarcity and fear. The promise that had brought her to this place echoed in her memory. She would never go hungry again. But more importantly, she had created a world where others could make the same claim. The woman who had once been denied scraps now ensured that her entire community lived in abundance.